Welcome to Martha Family Secrets Stories. You know what the worst way to start your day is? Getting arrested.
Yeah,
That's right. Federal handcuffs clicking shut around your wrists before you've even had your morning coffee. My name is Sarah, and I'm a 32-year-old forensic accountant. And on what seemed like an ordinary Tuesday, my world completely shattered. The cold steel bit into my skin as the agents read me my rights. I remember thinking how surreal this all felt, like I was watching someone else's life fall apart. But here's the thing that kept me calm: I wasn't a victim. Not really. I was standing exactly where I'd planned to be. Please subscribe and like this video and listen to my story till the end and let me know which city you're listening from. That way, I can see how far my story has traveled. Seriously, I want to know where you are when you hear this. Are you in New York? London? Mumbai? Wherever you are, your support means everything to me. While the agents were reading those charges, my older brother and my parents were across town. They were popping expensive champagne, convinced they'd pulled off the perfect crime. They thought they'd successfully framed me for a $30 million embezzlement scheme that my brother actually orchestrated. They really believed they'd won. But they forgot something microscopic. Something so small they completely overlooked it. My silence wasn't surrender. It was a trap. And they'd walked right into it. The marble lobby of my firm turned into an absolute circus when we arrived. I could feel every eye on me. Dozens of colleagues stopped typing, stopped breathing, stopped existing in that moment. The lead agent's voice projected through the silence like thunder, announcing a federal warrant. The charges sounded even worse when said out loud: offshore slush funds, massive tax fraud, money laundering on a scale that made my chest feel tight just hearing it. I didn't struggle. I didn't beg for a lawyer or cry or do any of the things innocent people do when they're blindsided. I just stood there, breathing steadily, perfectly composed. Because I'd been waiting for this exact moment for 30 agonizing days. 30 days of planning. 30 days of knowing exactly what they were going to do. A rough hand pressed down on my shoulder, and I was forced into the back of that dark government vehicle. The heavy door slammed shut, and suddenly the frantic whispers of my coworkers were muffled and gone. Just me and the silence and the weight of what I was about to do. Can you imagine being arrested in front of everyone you work with? The humiliation, the shock, the confusion, but here's what most people don't realize: sometimes the best strategy is to look guilty when you're actually 3 steps ahead. So here's the question I need you to think about. If your own family, the people who raised you, who taught you right from wrong, what if they decided to destroy you to protect themselves? Would you panic? Would you cry? Or would you dig a legal grave they could never escape from? The interrogation room smelled like desperation and old coffee. That's the only way I can describe it. The walls were this nauseating off-white that seemed to close in on you, and there was one fluorescent light buzzing overhead like an angry wasp trapped in a cage. No windows. No mirrors. Just a steel table bolted to the floor and 2 aluminum chairs that had definitely seen better days. Agent Marcus Knox walked in like he owned the room. He had this terrifying calm about him, the kind of composure you only develop after spending decades dealing with white-collar criminals. He didn't shove me into my chair. He didn't bark orders like some street cop. He just pulled out his seat with this meticulous precision, unbuttoned his jacket, and tossed a thick manila folder onto the table. What happened next was pure psychology. He didn't yell. He didn't slam his fists or demand a confession. He just sat there. Staring. Waiting. Weaponizing silence. Because he knew what silence does to people. It fills them with panic. It makes them want to talk, to explain, to desperately convince you of their innocence. But I didn't flinch. I didn't even blink. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and controlled. The federal government does not execute a highly public arrest warrant for an executive without an airtight foundation, he said, sliding a piece of paper toward my handcuffed wrists. It was an executive mandate. My name was right there. My verified digital signature. My secure cryptographic token generated exclusively from my corporate email. I was the chief financial officer. On paper, I had complete control over every dollar that moved through that company. According to your father's corporate bylaws, whoever holds this authorization is the sole architect of the firm's capital flow, he continued, systematically dealing out more documents like a blackjack dealer handing out a losing hand. Wire transfer logs. Routing receipts. Highlighted numbers showing millions of dollars flowing to the Cayman Islands. A classic offshore slush fund structure designed to hide tax evasion on a massive scale. I could see him building his cage around me, bar by bar. He wasn't asking if I'd done it. He was demonstrating that according to the physical evidence, I was the only mathematical possibility. He was showing me that my family had weaponized the legal infrastructure of their own company to ensure I'd be crushed by the federal justice system. I need you to clarify the exact chronological timeline of these routing commands, he said, leaning into my space now, invading my physical comfort zone. His gray eyes were searching mine for a crack, a flinch, any sign of panic. This was brilliant and brutal psychology. If I argued about the timeline, I'd admit to the transactions. If I denied it, I'd be contradicting federal banking logs. Either way, I trapped myself into a corner with no escape route. But see, that's where Marcus made his first mistake. He thought he was interrogating a panicked embezzler. He had no idea he was sitting across from someone who'd been planning this for a month. I looked him dead in the eyes. I didn't break. I didn't look away. I just sat there, absorbing that interrogative stare, while my mind rewound to the exact moment this disaster had begun. The moment my family decided I was expendable. It all started at a family dinner at my parents' house. My father, Vincent, he usually commanded the dining room with this booming arrogance. But that night, he was slumped over his untouched prime rib, rubbing his temples like the weight of the world was crushing him. My mother, Patricia, she hovered nearby with trembling hands, pouring expensive Cabernet wine, shooting these worried, tearful glances at him. It was all theater. I just didn't know it yet. Then came the performance. Vincent looked up, his voice cracking with this calculated vulnerability I'd never heard from him before. He told us that the family firm was facing a mandatory financial review by state regulators. He said Grant, my older brother, the golden child, was completely overwhelmed. Grant was suffering from severe burnout, he claimed. Making catastrophic administrative errors because he didn't have the accounting expertise to navigate a state-level audit. My stomach sank even as he was speaking, because I knew. I work in forensic accounting. I investigate corporate fraud for a living. And I could smell the lie coming from him like rotting fruit. Vincent reached across the mahogany table and grabbed my hands. His grip was crushing, desperate. I'm not asking you to fix the numbers, he said. I'm not asking you to commit a crime. I just need you to sign a temporary authorization. Just put your name on this one document saying you're the acting CFO. Just for a few weeks. Just to get us through the audit. He painted it so beautifully. A senior forensic accountant with my credentials would immediately satisfy the regulator's compliance checks. It would buy Grant time to recover and organize the actual ledgers. It made perfect sense. It was plausible. It was a masterpiece of manipulation. My mother started weeping. She was begging me to save my brother from a mental breakdown. To keep the business my father built from being dismantled by bureaucrats. She wasn't pointing a gun at my head. She was handing me a pen and crying. And in that moment, my instincts screamed at me. A healthy, solvent company doesn't need a phantom CFO to survive a routine state audit. That doesn't happen. But a company that's structurally hollow? A company where the designated heir has drowned himself in his own incompetence? That company would grasp at straws. That company would be desperately constructing a fire break. And they'd chosen me to be the combustible material. I knew Grant wasn't suffering from burnout. I knew my father's empire was rotting from the inside. I knew they were setting me up to absorb the shockwave when everything collapsed. The logical thing would have been to stand up, walk out, and never speak to them again. But I didn't. I picked up that expensive fountain pen. I looked into my father's calculating eyes. I looked past my mother's theatrical tears. And I signed away my legal identity. I gave them the cryptographic token they needed to authorize offshore transfers. I handed them the key to my own destruction. But here's the thing, I did it because I needed to know exactly how deep their betrayal ran. I needed to understand how far they'd go. And I needed proof. This is the moment everything changed. The moment I stopped being a family member and became an investigator again. The moment I decided that whatever happened next, I'd be ready. So as I sat across from Agent Marcus Knox in that interrogation room, I wasn't panicking. I was about to show him that I'd already won. I leaned forward in that aluminum chair, and the metal cuffs rattled softly. Marcus was still building his case, still convinced he had me cornered. He had no idea what was coming. I don't need a defense attorney, I told him, my voice completely steady. And I'm not waiting for a federal subpoena. I'm waiting for you to realize that the documents on your desk are heavily altered byproducts of a much larger active investigation. I watched his face. The calculated authoritative posture he'd maintained since walking in fractured for just a microscopic second. Suspects facing decades in prison don't usually respond to overwhelming physical evidence with a critique of the investigator's file. They demand phone calls. They hyperventilate. They scream about their innocence. The digital footprint attached to those wire transfers is absolute, he countered, his jaw tightening. The authorization stems directly from your IP address. I'm not trying to talk my way out of anything, I said calmly. I'm trying to prevent you from making a catastrophic procedural error. Exactly 12 hours before your tactical team arrested me, my legal counsel submitted a comprehensive suspicious activity report directly to FinCEN, the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. I watched the muscles in his neck strain against his collar. He was no longer looking at a cornered suspect. He was looking at an anomaly. I didn't spend the last 30 days waiting to be arrested, I continued, my voice measured and precise. I spent the last 30 days executing a shadow audit on the firm's internal servers. I mapped every single hidden ledger. I cross-referenced the routing numbers of those Cayman shell corporations. I isolated the exact source codes used to execute the transfers. I packaged everything into an encrypted dossier and handed it over to the federal government before you even drafted my arrest warrant. Marcus scoffed, but there was no superiority in the sound anymore. Just desperation. A preemptive filing doesn't negate the fact that your signature authorized the theft. No, I agreed. But the metadata embedded within that filing proves that my signature was applied to completely different documents. If you look at the transaction logs on that table, the execution dates align perfectly with the days following my appointment as CFO. It looks flawless. Chronologically perfect. I paused. Let the silence stretch. Let him understand what was coming. But if you cross-reference those logs with the raw data package my attorney uploaded to FinCEN, you'll discover something glaring. Those transaction files were retroactively backdated. The actual capital flight occurred 3 months ago, while Grant was still the sole administrator. My parents manipulated the internal server clock and merged my cryptographic token with historical transfer orders to make it appear as though I orchestrated the theft. He stared at me. Really stared at me. I gave him the key to verify everything, I said, reciting a complex hash timestamp from memory. The cryptographic hash function is immutable. It cannot be forged. It cannot be altered. It is an absolute mathematical certainty. Marcus didn't argue. He didn't try to reassert his dominance. The technical specificity I'd just weaponized against his physical evidence left no room for conventional interrogation tactics. He reached across the table, picked up his encrypted smartphone, and made a call to the IRS Digital Forensics Unit. "This is Knox," he said. "I need an expedited cross-reference on an independent data package. Run a verification check against our current corporate embezzlement evidence." The wait was excruciating. The ringing tone echoed through the small concrete room. I didn't shift in my chair. I just watched him watch the table. Digital forensics agent Miller speaking, a crisp voice finally crackled through the speaker. Miller, I need you to verify the origin parameters and internal routing sequences, Marcus said. Copy that. Stand by, Miller responded. We could hear rapid keyboard clattering. The silence that followed was heavy. Marcus was a man accustomed to being the smartest person in the room. Now he was considering the possibility that he was merely a pawn in a much larger game. What happens when the hunter realizes they've been hunted the whole time? When the predator realizes they're actually the prey? Agent Knox, Miller's voice returned, noticeably tighter than before. I've located the encrypted submission. The metadata is immaculate. The chronological discrepancies are present. Those transfer files were unequivocally backdated. Marcus's jaw tightened so hard I thought I might hear his teeth grind. Are you confirming that the authorization signatures were artificially merged with historical data? He asked, his voice dropping. Yes, sir, Miller confirmed. The digital footprint doesn't originate from the suspect's registered IP address. We mapped the signal origin. They traced directly to a secure private residential network in an affluent subdivision just outside the city. Whose residence? Marcus demanded. The property is registered to a limited liability corporation, but the utility bills and network administration are under the name Grant, Miller reported. My brother's name hung in the air like a death knell. But proving Grant initiated the transfers was only half the battle. I needed Marcus to see where the stolen capital had actually gone. Agent Miller, I interjected, speaking clearly toward the speakerphone. Filter the destination routing numbers through the independent audit package. Track the liquidation phase of the offshore accounts. Marcus glared at me momentarily, furious at the interruption. But he didn't mute the line. He needed the complete picture just as much as I did. Filtering now, Miller said. The typing resumed. After a few moments, the analyst let out a low whistle. The capital didn't stay in the Caymans. It was aggressively layered through a series of shell companies and immediately repatriated into the domestic banking system. The endpoint is a blind trust. Pierce the veil, Marcus ordered, all professional detachment stripped from his voice. Who is the primary beneficiary? The trust is structured to disperse funds directly to high-end asset management firms and private creditors, Miller explained. We're looking at massive sustained payments liquidating debts at 3 separate offshore sports betting syndicates. The remaining capital was utilized to purchase a $2 million custom yacht docked in Miami and a limited edition Italian sports car. Marcus pushed through anyway. And the signatory on the trust? Grant, Miller confirmed. He's the sole beneficiary and the only individual with liquidation authority. The architecture of the crime was fully illuminated. My brother hadn't stolen millions to keep the family firm afloat. He'd bled the company dry to fund a catastrophic gambling addiction and a lifestyle of nauseating excess. My parents had willingly participated in a conspiracy to frame me not to save their legacy, but to protect a parasitic son from a federal prison sentence. Marcus didn't ask any further questions. He reached forward and slammed the receiver down onto the cradle. The sharp, violent click severed the connection, plunging the room back into absolute silence. He slowly leaned back in his chair. The calm, calculating demeanor of a federal investigator was completely gone, replaced by the icy aura of a man who realized he'd been manipulated into acting as cleanup crew for a family of arrogant wealthy criminals. Your shadow audit proves Grant is the sole architect, he stated, his voice stripped of its previous interrogative edge, replaced by something collaborative. But it still doesn't explain the origin of the primary catalyst. We received an anonymous tip through the IRS whistleblower hotline. The caller provided your exact schedule, your employee identification number, and the specific routing protocols. A backdated server log doesn't generate a human phone call. He was right. A digital frame job requires a physical trigger. I couldn't hack a telecommunication satellite from an interrogation room. I couldn't magically trace a burned IP address. But I don't need to, I said, adjusting the cold steel cuffs on my lap. People who believe they're clever enough to outsmart the federal government often overlook the simplest physics. Play the audio file. Marcus didn't hesitate. The undeniable accuracy of my previous revelations had completely shifted the power dynamic. He retrieved his encrypted government-issued smartphone and tapped the screen a few times. He set the device on the metal table, sliding it toward me so the speaker faced me directly. The audio file began with the sterile automated greeting of the federal reporting line, followed by a sharp click. Then a heavily digitally distorted voice began to speak. 2 octaves lower. Gender masked. Completely synthetic. The masked voice meticulously recited my name, my corporate title, and explicitly accused me of structuring millions of dollars into Caribbean tax havens. A premium voice masking software. A proxy server located in Eastern Europe. Completely anonymous. Or so they thought. You're listening to the synthetic voice, I told Marcus. Ignore the words. Focus on the ambient environment. Play it again, but isolate the background frequencies. Filter out the vocal track and amplify the ambient noise floor. Marcus picked up the phone, accessing a built-in forensic equalizer app. He slid his thumb across the screen, aggressively dampening the distorted vocal frequencies and boosting the background audio spectrum. He hit play for the second time. Without the synthetic voice dominating the track, the acoustic reality was exposed. Beneath the digital static, a very distinct rhythmic sound echoed softly in the background. Clink. 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 It was the resonant high-pitched chime of solid brass tubes striking one another. A 32-inch resonant wind chime. That's not a generic digital notification, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. That's the acoustic signature of a custom-forged heavy brass wind chime. Marcus frowned, leaning in closer, his trained ears catching the subtle detail. A wind chime doesn't constitute a geographical location. It does when it's paired with the secondary auditory signature, I instructed. Listen closely to the 10-second mark right after the caller pauses to breathe. Behind the soft chiming, a sudden aggressive mechanical hiss erupted. A sharp high-pressure release of steam. A deep rhythmic humming sound. That mechanical hiss is a commercial-grade dual-boiler espresso machine venting its pressure valve, I stated, my voice clinical and precise. My parents renovated their sprawling estate 5 years ago. They installed an open-concept living space. In that space, directly next to a massive bay window where a heavy brass wind chime hangs, sits a custom-built Italian espresso machine that vents automatically every 20 minutes. I looked up from the phone, locking eyes with the federal agent. The person who dialed your secure whistleblower hotline didn't make the call from a burner phone in a dark alley. They didn't call from a public library. They made the call from the plush leather sofa in the center of my father's living room. They used a cheap online proxy service to mask the phone number, completely ignorant of the fact that the microphone was picking up the highly specific acoustic fingerprint of their own house. Marcus stared at the smartphone, realization washing over him like ice water. It was my mother, I said, finally naming the architect of my arrest. My voice didn't waver. Patricia doesn't understand digital encryption, but she understands how to read a script my father handed her. She called your agency, sipping her morning coffee, and calmly provided the exact details needed to ensure her daughter would be dragged out of her office in handcuffs. All to guarantee her son would never face the consequences of his own greed. The recording reached its conclusion. A long, agonizing beep signaled the end of the file. The piercing electronic tone faded into the concrete walls, leaving behind a heavy, suffocating silence. The irrefutable truth about a mother who had willingly engineered the destruction of her own child. An absolute unforgiving line in the sand. One that could never be uncrossed. Not a single tear fell from my eyes. The reservoir of pity I possessed for those people had run completely dry the moment I signed that fiduciary authorization. The horrific reality of a mother casually sipping an espresso while orchestrating her daughter's incarceration didn't break me. It merely validated the ruthless countermeasures I'd already set in motion. Marcus looked like a man who'd just watched a vehicle violently careen off a cliff. He reached toward the table, his hand hovering over the manila folder filled with forged documents, preparing to gather the evidence needed to secure an immediate federal arrest warrant for Grant. You don't need to rush, I said, my voice cutting through the thick, lingering tension. They're not going anywhere. In fact, their ability to flee this jurisdiction was neutralized precisely 15 minutes ago. He stopped. His hand froze midair over the files. He looked at me with a mixture of profound exhaustion and deep weary curiosity. "What exactly did you do?" he asked, and I could hear the fear in his voice. Fear that he was dealing with something far beyond his usual cases. "I'm a forensic accountant," I explained, shifting my weight against the rigid back of the aluminum chair. "But my primary expertise lies in automated financial architecture." When I realized FinCEN and Grant were constructing a fire break to protect that offshore trust, I knew a simple audit report wouldn't be enough. If they sensed an IRS investigation closing in, Grant would instantly liquidate the Cayman accounts, transfer the remaining capital to an untraceable cryptocurrency wallet, and board a private charter out of the country before you could even draft a subpoena. I paused, letting the magnitude of my planning sink in. "So 3 weeks ago," I continued, "I embedded a smart contract trigger deep within the firm's primary enterprise resource planning software. A highly classified automated compliance lock. The trigger was dormant, waiting for a very specific set of parameters." Marcus slowly lowered himself back into his seat, realizing the game he thought was over had merely entered its final invisible phase. "The moment your tactical team executed the public arrest warrant in my lobby this morning," I explained, "my firm's human resources department officially flagged my employee profile as suspended under federal investigation. That status change was the first parameter." I leaned forward, the metallic clink of my handcuffs underscoring the finality of my words. Right now, sitting in that sprawling suburban living room, my brother is undoubtedly celebrating my arrest. Believing I'm sitting in this concrete box, stripped of all access, his narcissistic compulsion will force him to log into the administrative portal to finalize the transfer of the remaining slush fund. That login attempt coupled with my suspended status fulfills the second parameter. And here's where it all falls apart for them. Here's where their own arrogance becomes their downfall. "And what happens when the trigger executes?" Marcus asked, his voice low, almost reverent. "It detonates a digital-shaped charge," I answered coldly. "The smart contract automatically generates a critical anti-money laundering red flag, bypassing local management entirely. It transmits a direct unalterable violation report to the Securities and Exchange Commission along with the complete routing history of the blind trust." Marcus's eyes widened. The IRS was powerful, but the SEC meant triggering an immediate catastrophic corporate shutdown. Simultaneously, I continued, delivering the final fatal blow, the script executes a kill switch protocol integrated with the firm's primary banking institutions. It forces an immediate lockdown on all associated accounts. I could see the pieces clicking into place in his mind. The realization of what I'd done. So while they're currently clinking crystal glasses and toasting to their brilliant deception, I concluded, they're completely unaware that every corporate line of credit, every personal checking account, and every piece of collateral tied to that estate has been seized by the federal banking system. Their credit cards are declined. Their liquid assets are frozen. They are financially paralyzed. Marcus stared at me for a long, silent moment. He was no longer looking at a suspect or a cooperative witness. He was looking at an architect of absolute uncompromising justice. The legal extraction that followed was executed with terrifying precision. No dramatic tactical teams kicking down mahogany doors with drawn weapons. Instead, a fleet of dark government sedans quietly arrived at my parents' sprawling estate. Federal agents calmly presented the asset freeze mandates, methodically seizing every electronic device, luxury vehicle, and physical financial record on the premises. Grant's collapse was absolute. He was indicted on 12 counts of wire fraud, tax evasion, and conspiracy. Without access to the offshore slush fund or the family's paralyzed accounts, he couldn't afford a high-powered defense attorney. A public defender was assigned. He accepted a plea deal guaranteeing 2 decades in a minimum security federal penitentiary with no parole eligibility. My father, the once untouchable patriarch, faced an equally brutal reality. To satisfy the crushing penalties imposed by the Securities and Exchange Commission, he was forced to liquidate the estate and surrender his entire equity stake in the firm. He avoided a lengthy prison sentence only by cooperating with the investigation against his son. A cowardly final act that permanently destroyed whatever remained of their familial bond. The corporate fallout was swift. The primary lending banks immediately placed the heavily indebted firm into federal receivership. Given my impeccable credentials and my role in uncovering the massive internal fraud, the consortium of creditors appointed me as the sole acting restructuring officer. I walked into the firm's executive boardroom, taking my seat at the head of the long glass table. I was no longer a temporary shield or a convenient scapegoat. I was the architect of the firm's survival, systematically purging the toxic administrative rot my father had tolerated for years. My assistant walked in one day, placing a single handwritten envelope on my desk. The return address indicated a low-income rental complex 3 states away. It was from my mother. The letter was a pathetic, sprawling, desperate plea. She was begging me to leverage my new corporate authority to financially support her and my father in their bankruptcy. She was asking for a sliver of forgiveness for what she called a momentary lapse in judgment. I didn't read past the first paragraph. I fed the heavy parchment directly into the mechanical shredder beneath my desk, watching the blades turn their toxic legacy into meaningless confetti. Here's what I've learned. The reality of family is often romanticized. We're weaponized with the idea that we need to force loyalty where none is deserved. We're conditioned to believe that sharing DNA mandates infinite forgiveness. But this is the brutal, uncompromising truth. Blood does not excuse abuse. Biological proximity is never a valid justification for financial or emotional violence. When the people supposed to protect you decide to use you as a human shield to mask their own corruption, your only obligation is to yourself. You must establish boundaries so razor-sharp they draw blood if crossed. You must recognize that sometimes the only way to survive a malignant familial tumor is a complete, ruthless surgical excision. Tell me in the comments. And if you've dealt with something similar, share your story. You're not alone. Subscribe for more stories about standing your ground and reclaiming your life. Because your peace, your dignity, and your future are worth protecting. Always.